Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about a world first of an aircraft, the first operational combat-ready jet fighter in the world, in the Messerschmitt Me-262, an absolutely iconic aircraft. Now, it makes perfect sense that Germany ended up having the first operational jet fighter in the world, since they also had the first operational turbojet aircraft ever, in the Heinkel HE-178. The 178 flew for the first time just a few days before the start of World War II, thus effectively signaling the start of the jet age even before the war had started. Of course, it wouldn't really be until after the war that jet engines were serviceable enough to see production and use on a much greater scale, but I digress. Several months before the 178 took to the air, the Luftwaffe and Reich Air Ministry, seeing the progress that was being made on jet engine technology, sent out a request for a jet aircraft. And thus a few months before the start of World War II, the Me-262 would be born, in the form of Project 1065. From this birthday, progress on the 262 would be rather slow. This was probably at least partially due to the ramping up for the war effort, and Messerschmitt having to make a metric ton of Bf-109s and Bf-110s. That certainly would impede development. But much greater factors that were impeding the 262 were the studying and research needed for the aircraft's frame, the development of the jet engines that were sufficiently powerful enough, and the intervention of German leadership. For that last point, Luftwaffe head and noted morphine addict Hermann Göring would divert research teams and funding away from jet engine development and research. The reason for this was likely the early war belief that Germany would be able to win and win quickly with more conventional than modern-day aircraft, and so those planes like the Bf-109 and Bf-110 should be invested in much more, rather than this future technology that was at least several years out. And honestly, considering that hindsight is 2020, I do understand that decision, and I think it was logical for him to do so. But because of that decision and the rather slow development of Germany's jet engines in the BMW 3 and Junkers Umo 4, it wouldn't be until April 1941 that the Me-262 would take to the air for the first time, and even then it wasn't in the air with a jet engine, but rather a single normal inline piston engine, a Umo 210 specifically, just slapped into the nose to test out the aerodynamic capabilities of the 262's frame. Instead, it was another full year and some change that the Me-262, with two Umo 4 jet engines, would finally take to the air in July 1942. For the next couple years after that, the 262 would undergo a multitude of changes, with influence and/or interference from German leadership, until it finally began production in 1944. The production of it was also slow, due to supply shortages, and just the general newness of jet technology. But when they eventually found their way into combat, the 262 proved to be quite the effective aircraft, with a top speed that was well over 500 miles an hour. Now, at some point in the future, we'll probably do a whole video on the Me-262 specifically, but for right now, I want to focus back in on the first jet flight of the 262, back in 1942. When the 262 was undergoing its initial jet engine tests, present at a number of these tests were Japanese diplomats and military men, bearing witness to the next generation of aircraft technology. While Japan already had interest in jet engine technology before this point, their viewing of the 262 made quite the impression on them, and inspired them to eventually create their own version of the 262, with their own copy of the jet engines that Germany was making. This copycat aircraft is our subject for today, Japan's attempt to create a game-changing plane that would be hopefully better than anything in their current arsenal. This is the Nakajima Kikka, which translates to orange blossom. And side note, I love some of the Japanese plane names. You know, here's a jet fighter, let's name it after a flower. But anyway, the story of the Kika begins after the Japanese diplomats witnessed the Me-262. It was a rather slow burn of a beginning though, as even though those diplomats sent back reports to the Japanese military speaking very highly of the 262 and its new jet engine technology, it wouldn't be until over 2 years later that work on the Kika began in earnest. Why exactly there was such a gap, I am not sure, but I suspect it had something to do with Germany and Japan negotiating sending data or samples over to Japan. Germany wouldn't have all that much data or constructed models of their own jet engines and jet planes, so they would probably be not all that enthusiastic about sending limited data and resources to another country, even if that country is their ally. But as Germany would be much further along in their jet development by late 1943 and early 1944, Japan would send a team over to German-controlled France, a team of engineers and researchers and whatnot, to collect a veritable smorgasbord of German tech and data, some blueprints of the Me-262, and Messerschmitt Me-163, a rocket interceptor. They would also get some versions of the jet engines and data on them. They would get some aircraft parts, and possibly they would get an entire Me-163 aircraft. Due to the war that was currently ongoing, and the Axis powers starting to lose that war, transporting all of this stuff from France to Japan would be an arduous and tricky process. By air was certainly a no-go, it was just too much stuff to transport. By surface vessel was a no-go as well, just too dangerous. By land was certainly a no-go, too much distance across Allied territory, can't imagine the Soviet Union would just let Japan ride on through, so really the only option was to transport it all by submarine. And sometime in early to mid-1944, Japanese submarine I-29 departed from France and undertook that dangerous trek back across the globe. Surprisingly, I-29 made it all the way to Japanese-controlled Singapore unscathed, but shortly after departing from Singapore, I-29 would encounter Allied forces. It was detected and then was quickly sunk, with all of the tech and information on board being lost to the sea. But luckily for Japan, for some reason, one of the I-29 passengers, a man named Eiichi Iwaya, departed from Singapore separately from the I-29 and the rest of his compatriots, and he would carry with him some rather rudimentary info on the jet engines and the aircraft, some of his personal notes, some pictures, and a simple cutaway image of the BMW 3 jet engine. And unlike his compatriots, he managed to make it back to Japan safely, and it was with his very limited data that Japan would base their own Me-262 copy around. Now, for a notable difference here, Japan would be working off of limited info on the BMW 3, not the Yumo 4 engine that the 262 used, but still, all things considered, that wasn't that big of a deal. The much bigger deal was making an actual functioning jet engine in late war Japan. Keep well in mind that Japan didn't have the greatest success with inline liquid-cooled engines, so jumping over to jet engines would certainly be an incredible leap. In September 1944, the Japanese Navy would issue specifications to the company Nakajima, and they called for a plane that was effectively a lesser Me-262. Requested was a fighter-bomber, with a great top speed and a bomb capacity around 1,100 pounds. To this request, Nakajima returned with a design that effectively looked like a smaller, more rudimentary Me-262. Measuring it at 8.1 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 3 meters tall, the Kika was shorter by 2.5 meters both length and width-wise, and it was almost a meter shorter height-wise. This wasn't a surprising difference, considering both that Japanese planes were comparatively pretty small, and whatever engine they would be using on this was almost guaranteed to be weaker than the Yumo-4, so a smaller and lighter frame was more preferable. The surfaces of the Kika in the wings and tail generally mimic the Me-262, but were more simplistic. The swept-back wings of the 262 were replaced with just having the leading edge swept back, and the tail surfaces on the Kika were more blocky and just basic. Initially, the Kika was designed to use the Su-11 motor jet engine, an early and more rudimentary type of jet engine that only had about 440 pounds of thrust. This compared to almost 2,000 pounds of thrust on the Yumo-4. This was then quickly changed over to the Su or Ne-12, that had around 750 pounds of thrust. However, it was then quickly determined that neither of these engines had enough power, which then brought the very limited data they had on the BMW 3 more into prominence, and based off of that limited data, the Ishikawajima Ne-20 would be born, an effective Japanese copy of the BMW 3. It wasn't a perfect copy by any stretch of the imagination, and the Ne-20 was slightly smaller, lighter, and just less powerful, giving just over 1,000 pounds of thrust compared to 1,300 pounds of thrust for the initial BMW 3 model. Still, with the smaller Kika frame, that was pretty much fine, or at least fine when the plane was in the air. On the ground, it was less fine. Early jet engines took quite a while to spool up, and they had rather poor acceleration, which necessitated either a really long runway or some additional rocket boosters to assist in the takeoff. The Kika intended to go with the latter, and would attach a handful of rocket boosters. These rocket boosters would be even more vital for the Kika though, as the role for the Kika had been slowly evolving for the Japanese Navy. Instead of just being your standard fighter or interceptor like the Me-262, the Kika design was to be altered to better fit the late war situation that Japan found themselves in. On one hand, the Kika would have its wings be able to fold, to allow them to fit into more narrow spaces. The intent was to place planes like the Kika, along with your standard piston engine aircraft, into caves and other tight spaces, for some surprise attacks and surprise defense, I guess. Because the runways would be incredibly short when launching from these caves and tight spaces, this made the rocket boosters absolutely vital. Additionally, because it was late war Japan, it was intended for the Kika to serve as a kamikaze aircraft. So, thinking about that for more than 5 seconds, this was an incredibly stupid idea, for the sole reason that Japan's resources were already very limited. So why exactly would you attach jet engines engines that take a lot of vital resources to make, to a plane that you intend to be completely disposable. Japan was desperate, and when you're desperate, you do stupid things. In fact, adding to this point, Japan's resources were so limited already that they could barely make those jet engines in the first place. The turbine blades of the Ne-20, for example, were lacking the stronger metals that they needed, and as a result, those turbine blades had to be replaced every few hours. This meant that basically, if the Ne-20 went into full-scale production, the planes that used them would have to have the turbine blades replaced every single flight, not only taking a lot of time, but a lot of resources. To put it mildly, making these engines probably wasn't the best idea for where Japan was at. But regardless, they pressed on, and due to a multitude of factors, their work was rather troubled. In part, this would be due to production and testing of the Ne-20 engines being a very frantic affair, with engineers desperately trying to get them up and running, with military leadership just breathing down their necks. But probably the bigger factor hampering the Kika was just the general war situation, with Allied bombers increasingly raining down explosives on Japanese towns, cities, and factories, destroying resources and delaying production all across the country. There was also an earthquake in late 1944 that hampered a lot of Japanese production as well, although I can't definitively say that it hampered the Kika specifically. Simply put, Japan had a lot of things going on at the time. But by late June 1945, the first prototype Kika was ready for some preliminary testing, to spool up its engines for some ground trials, and over a month later, on August 7, 1945, the first Kika was finally ready to take to the air, outfitted with 2 Ne-20 engines. In that initial test flight, surprisingly everything went pretty well. Only flying for as long as half an hour, the jet engines worked fine, the plane supposedly handled pretty well, and just generally there weren't any notable issues during the flight. The only real problem was that the takeoff run was considered to be too long, an issue that plagued all of the early jet-powered planes. So for the Kika here, that was less a problem and more just a feature of early jets. The top speed of this prototype, whether it was actually performed or just estimated, was a solid 432 miles an hour, at a gross weight of 8,995 pounds. The range for the Kika was estimated to be somewhere between 127 miles all the way up to 586 miles, a range that I tend to believe was more towards the lower end, considering the gas-guzzling nature of early jet engines and the Kika's smaller frame not being able to hold that much fuel. But still, early performance for the Kika was rather promising, and 4 days later, it would take to the air again, and this time, it would have some rocket boosters installed to help assist in the takeoff and shorten that takeoff run. That decision, though, while intended to help the Kika get into the air faster, actually ended up doing the exact opposite. When the rockets were activated, they were installed in such a way that it just flung the plane forward, uncontrollably so, and raised the nose off the ground, but only raised the nose off the ground. When the rockets finally ceased firing, the nose just smacked back down onto the runway. While miraculously it was still intact after this, all of that uncontrolled movement had pushed the plane towards the end of the runway, and its speed was still quite low at this stage, and since taking off normally would take quite a long time with these early jet engines, the pilot had no other choice but to just try and slow the plane down as much as he could, and hope that when he skid off the runway and towards the sea, that there wasn't too much damage to the plane. Luckily, the plane ended up being largely intact, with only minor damage, but it still delayed the project until either the first prototype was fixed or the second prototype was ready. As fate would have it, though, on August 15, 1945, the Kika project came to an abrupt end, with one prototype completed, one almost completed, and another 23 in development. Now, recall the date of the first flight, August 7, 1945. Something happened the day prior to that flight, a pretty significant event that kinda shaped the future of the world, in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki, and 6 days after that, Japan surrendered. So by the time the Kika took to the air for the first time on August 7th, the war was kind of over. Japan was screwed, and yet they still tested it, and had plans to continue testing it. Was it insanity? Was it faith? Was it pride? Who knows, but for the purpose of this video, the Kika project was now forcibly dead. But let's still assume for a second that the Kika had actually made it into production, let's say at the start of 1945. If that happened, how would it have performed? While the hope would have been for it to be Japan's own Me-262, a hyper-fast fighter that Allied aircraft simply could not keep up with, the top speed of the Kika, while fast for a Japanese fighter, was still less than planes like the P-51 Mustang. Plus, the Kika achieved that top speed with no armament, apart from a projected bomb load of around 1,100 pounds. To be competitive in late World War II, they would need to add a plethora of 12.7 mil guns, or several 20 mil cannons, or perhaps a 30 mil cannon. Adding all of these guns would inevitably add a great deal of weight, reducing top speed and maneuverability. So, because of what they would have to do to make it into a viable fighter, the Kika probably wouldn't have been better than some of Japan's other late war fighters, like the Shinden or the Ki-100 or Ki-84. If they instead went the route of making it a kamikaze plane, as previously stated, that would have been incredibly wasteful, and they may as well just have been catapulting their resources into the ocean. Ultimately, despite the fact that the Kika being made at all and flying at all was rather impressive, given the state of the war and the problems with the Submarine I-29, the whole Kika kerfuffle was probably just a major waste of time and effort. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. The whole I-29 submarine story almost sounds like you wrote it for a movie, like a war drama, where all hope seems to be lost. But miraculously, the guy makes it back home with the data in hand, ready to save the country, like he comes out of the ocean, just walking out of the ocean, and he's soaking wet, and he's holding up a briefcase. If you ignore the actual end result here of them making a plane that was kind of pointless, it's a great story. We can take some liberties with the story to make it more interesting. That's what movies do anyway. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.